was no difference between the amount of exercise these kids did, regardless of which school they went to. And so the researchers came up with this term called the activity stat, where they postulated that kids are going to get a certain amount of exercise. If they do it all at school, they'll do less at home. If they do nothing at school, they're going to do more at home. And whether that's in the form of NEAT type exercise, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and they're moving more and they're fidgeting more and they're pacing more, who knows? But what they did not find was that a difference of schools with 9 hours a week of physical activity, which is a tremendous amount compared to those with 1.8 and no facilities, that's a surprising result. In terms of, is it really surprising? Well, maybe it's not as surprising as all that. So this was a study looking at 18 clinical trials with durations between 6 months and 3 years. They looked at over 18,000 students. This is a Canadian. I think I've got the reference on the next page. But looking at the impact of school-based phys ed programs on children's obesity rates. And as you might imagine, given who's talking right now, there was no difference. And it led the authors to conclude that while physical activity is crucial and should be promoted in our schools, that school-based physical activity interventions do not improve body composition. And go to myth number 3. Myth number 3 is that we've all become lazy. We're going to adults now. That we're no longer physically active. And I don't really know what that picture is. But perhaps my favorite picture is this last one. But we're not physically active anymore, and as a consequence of us being extremely lazy, that we need help to do everything, that somehow this is causing us to gain weight. This is the cause, and I think Bob laid out a case for a decline in physical activity to be the cause of our obesity rates. I found different studies than Bob did. This was a study looking at 22 different years of energy expenditure studies in Maastricht in North America between 1983 and 2005. During that same time period in Holland, obesity rates rose by 50% and 100% in the United States. And in terms of energy expenditure or physical activity levels, they were looked at as well. In terms of the results, what they found was, I think, actually surprising. I didn't expect these results when I started reading the paper, but that energy expenditure in Europe and North America, according to the doubly labeled water experiments, hasn't changed. It hasn't changed between the 80s and 2005. They found that the energy expenditure in our modern society with escalators and dishwashers, etc., are the same as we would find in the third world, where we would expect people, all that labor saving that Bob was talking about, the 140 calories for men and the 120 calories for women was going to make a difference. And that reduced energy expenditure due to lowered physical activity was unlikely to have fueled the obesity epidemic. And so in terms of blaming the escalator, this was a fascinating study as well, looking at a comparison between rural Nigerian subsistence farming women and urban Chicago women. And they were measuring total energy expenditure and resting energy expenditure to infer exercise. So they didn't use doubly labeled water here. And they followed the women for 3 years. The average weight of a woman in Nigeria was 128 pounds. And the average weight of a woman in urban Chicago was 184 pounds. There was no difference in energy expenditure. None. And more importantly, I think, there was no measure of energy expenditure that they found that was associated with weight change in either group for the 3 years that were studied. So again, there was no relationship between how many hours or how much activity these women did, whether it was in Nigeria or in urban Chicago for 3 years. And so, you know, you got to wonder, was that just an anomaly? Was it a weird group of people? Was it a small sample size? Because it's such a strange result. There was a massive meta-analysis of doubly labeled water studies, 183 different cohorts, 5,000 subjects almost. They included studies from 14 countries that had low or middle human development indexes. So these, again, were the countries where we would not expect labor-saving devices to be a prominent part of society. And when they looked at the results, well, again, the total energy expenditure that was adjusted for weight and age or physical activity level didn't differ. And again, the authors conclude that it calls into question the role of energy expenditure in the cause of obesity at the population-based level. The fourth myth. we're going to be able to exercise it off, whether it's the shake weight or discoing with Richard Simmons, that, put aside everything I've just said, we can fix this problem with exercise. Regardless of whether or not it was or wasn't exercise that got us here, exercise will get us gone. It's not a myth. So this is the paper I'll skip over from Bob. You can exercise your weight away. He proved it very clearly. The problem is that we're talking about the real world. We're talking about the bedside. People don't diarize like they did in Bob's studies in terms of food diaries and keeping track of exercise. People do not, as a general rule in society, understand energy balance. And to an extent, I think they've been duped by public health messaging that says exercise is the bigger player or an equal player. Exercise in larger quantities may have some impacts too. May lead people to be hungry. They might compensatorily overeat, either because of hunger or because they feel they've earned it. I know that I often feel I've earned my seconds and thirds if I'm training and did a long run, but I know that the calories I can consume in 3 minutes are likely going to exceed all of the calories I burned in my exercise. And especially given that we do not provide this message as a general rule to society, I think that's what we tend to see. And time, of course, is very precious. We live in a very hectic world. And Bob's study had an hour of exercise daily to hit the 700-calorie burn. And I think it'd be wonderful if we could get people exercising an hour daily, but we haven't been able to do that ever. And so, in terms of the real world, the Dotenkemp study looked at 5,000 Dutch adults for 10 years. And they looked at their weight, waist circumference as a function, again, of their physical activity levels. Measurements at baseline in 10 years were done, but they also did something a little bit interesting. They asked a question, did you markedly increase your exercise during this time period? So they were studying whether people who started exercising more during the study protected themselves. They did not find any relationship with a single measurement at 5 years. But if they reanalyzed it, looking at that question, did you markedly increase your exercise? They did find a relationship with weight at 5 years. Sadly, that relationship disappeared at 10. And people who reported this marked increase in energy over the decade, they weighed 1.2 pounds less, and they had a 1/5 of an inch smaller waist circumference at the end of that 10-year period of time. The Nurses' Health Study, 34,000 women were monitored for 13 years. The 13%, there were 13% who did not gain weight over the course of that 10-year period of time. They started at a healthy weight, and they reported exercising an hour or more a day. There was no amount of exercise that was able to stop weight gain in the women who began this study already overweight. The Appeal study, 196 obese folks were asked to exercise for an hour a day, 6 days a week for a year. They were explicitly told not to make any dietary changes. And God knows how, but the researchers were able to inspire the men on average to exercise 6.16 hours, and the women 4.9 hours a week. So this is the exercise-only intervention for a year with a tremendous amount of exercise. And they did lose weight. Over the course of the year, the men lost 3.5 pounds, and the women 2.6 pounds. It was a dose-dependent relationship if you looked at it. So for every 91.5 hours a year that exercise occurred by these participants, they lost 1 pound. This result was actually confirmed again indirectly by this Amish study. So this is looking at the FTO gene, one of the genes we know is associated in obesity. They looked at 705 Amish folks, and they found that the Amish who were active for 3 to 4 hours more a day than their sedentary FTO counterpart containing Amish friend or brother were in fact 15 pounds lighter. And in that case, it was an 85-hour of exercise a year to affect that 1 pound difference. So slightly better than the 91.5 hours in the other study, but pretty darn close. So life's not fair. It's really not fair because exercise is essential, it seems, for weight maintenance. So studies on weight maintenance seem to very clearly state that if you don't exercise, you are far more likely to gain weight. And whoever said that life was fair? 201 women, randomized to one of 4 exercise arms with identical diets followed for 2 years. Very simply put, the folks who exercise more were more likely to maintain a 10% weight loss with identical diets. So it works. Look, aha! Not so fast. The folks who exercised the most burned on average 163 more calories a day than those exercising the least. And it wasn't enough exercise calorically to explain this difference. If you analyze the data a little bit further and you look at the dietary reports, the folks exercising the most were eating on average 444 fewer calories a day than the folks who were exercising the least. What they found was the folks exercising the most had much better eating behaviors. And if you think about it differently, the magnitude of their dietary intervention calorically, because we don't want to argue that thermodynamic rules don't apply to people, they had a 3-fold impact with their dietary behaviors versus their exercise behaviors. So what's the true role of exercise in weight management? It's crucial, absolutely crucial. We have it as part of our program in my office. I would not for a moment say it wasn't. It helps to moderate intake. It improves sleep. It cultivates an attitude of healthy living. It improves comorbid conditions, which in turn may impact on weight. It provides a functional caloric buffer. It does burn calories. I have worries, though. I have big worries about the role of exercise in weight management. And it's more about messaging than it is about fact. There's only so many dollars in the obesity research pot. I worry about interventions and studies being done purely looking at exercise without touching diet, given what we tend to see as real-world results on exercise. Public health messaging tends to ignore intake, especially with kids. We don't talk about intake. And I think as a consequence, we misinform choice. We are not providing a level playing field like Bob suggested we should. Exercise-based public health interventions designed to address obesity fail to promote the unbelievable benefits of exercise. That's why we should be promoting exercise. It is the most healthy thing we can do, but it is unlikely in the real world to have dramatic impacts on weight. And exercise-based obesity interventions, I think, risk being canceled when they don't yield dramatic results. So let's say we did get phys ed classes back in the schools, but somebody's studying whether or not it impacted on obesity rates in the kids, and it didn't. Well, that'd be a good reason to pull it back out of the school. But on the other hand, if we focus on other things that we can measure, as Bob was talking about, insulin resistance, blood pressure, you name it, visceral fat reduction, there's a lot of things that exercise will do. We'll lose those benefits. So why is there so much obesity? Well, so I have a different theory in terms of why there's so much obesity. Mine's food. This study looked at the energy gap in terms of what was being consumed by Canadians in 1976 versus 2003. There was an 18% increase in calories consumed. It's basically a meal worth. We're eating 4 meals a day, not 3 meals a day. Eat another meal a day, you're going to gain weight. And this was confirmed in America as well, looking at energy intake data from 1970. And they said that for adults, we're consuming 500 more calories, kids 350 more calories, and in turn, that explains things. You know, looking at the exercise that we're not getting in our jobs anymore is not the whole picture of exercise. People do other things. And whether adults have the activity stats or not, I'm not sure. But it's hard to look at exercise in the workplace as Bob presented it and extrapolate it to your total energy expenditure. We just don't know. Whereas here, we're talking about total energy consumption. And it does seem very clear that it will explain things. And why? Well, there's this wonderful series of slides that you can look at that look at whether or not what we're eating nowadays. And we're eating awful food. These aren't bad people. They're not trying to harm their kids. I did a piece with the CBC on a family here in Ottawa, and it was amazing what they were consuming we're being duped by a food industry that spends 170 times more money today than it did in the 70s to sell food. They wouldn't be